Oversight and Government Reform will reconvene without objection. Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. I want to thank our four witnesses for your patience with our vote series. The gentleman from Virginia and I will give our opening statements, and we'll recognize each of you for your opening statements, and then we'll start the questioning. This hearing is on one aspect of our criminal justice system. I want to say another thank you to our two senators that were with us, and I want to thank two people who are not with us today. One is Elijah Cummings for his commitment to criminal justice reform, which is a commitment that has spanned 3 decades. Mr. Cummings and I have spoken about today's hearing several times, and he very much wanted to be here. He'll be back soon, and we will continue to explore this topic, particularly within the jurisdiction of intergovernmental cooperation. I also want to thank Bob Goodlatte, who's the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Criminal justice reform is principally an issue within the jurisdiction of that committee. Chairman Goodlatte has been very gracious and accommodating and allowing us to go forward, even as he and his committee do the very same. And the reason there are at least 2 committees in the House that are exploring our justice system is because it is so vital to the strength and longevity of our republic. Our justice system must both be respected and worthy of respect. Our justice system must both be fair in reality and perceived as fair. Our justice system must be proportional. It must protect the innocents. It must punish those who have not conformed to societal norms, with those societal norms being reflected and codified in our law. Fair, even-handed, proportional, just, equal in intent and application. Those are not merely aspirations, those are expectations. They are our expectations for the world's most envied justice system. I guess blind is the word that most of us use to associate with justice. Justice is blind. It's blind to race. It's blind to gender. It's blind to status. It's blind to wealth. It's blind to everything other than the merits of the relative arguments. In reality, Lady Justice, who is the mythological personification of our aspirations and expectations, is not blind. She's blindfolded. She can see. She just affirmatively chooses not to see who or what is before her. And that is really hard. That requires discipline. It requires restraint. Lady Justice may not look, but that should not keep us from doing so, to make sure that our justice system is as perfect as mortals can make something. A significant percentage of our fellow citizens have some criminal history, and the overwhelming majority of those currently incarcerated will be released from confinement when the sentence is completed. What do we do when the sentences imposed have been served, the debt to society paid, the offender is re-entering society? There are familial obligations to be met. There are societal obligations to be met. There may well be restitution owed to the victims of previous conduct. And what we owe most to victims is to lower the chance that they will be victims again. It is in all of our interest these reentries be successful. It is in all of our interest these transitions back into society are successful. And those leaving incarceration for reentry will often find society has changed, sometimes dramatically. There will be educational deficits and skills deficits in addition to the challenge of overcoming the stigma of a conviction. Our penal system has several aspects to it. There's a punishment aspect, there's a separation from society aspect, there's also a rehabilitation aspect, a restoration, if you will, a correction. We ask the prisons at both the state and federal level to do a lot of things, and as I tell one of our witnesses, who is my friend, and he is the director of the Department of Corrections in South Carolina, Brian Sterling, he has the hardest job in all of law enforcement. Keep those confined who are supposed to be confined, protect the safety of the women and men working in the prisons, protect the safety of other inmates, provide health care, meals, and make sure those incarcerated are ready for reentry. And oh, by the way, you'll only make the news if something goes wrong or if there's an escape. Today is not about what's gone wrong or escapes. It's about hearing what works with respect to reentry, and it's about hearing how we can best serve the broader society by lowering recidivism. The lower the recidivism rate, the fewer the victims there are. The lower the recidivism rate, the lower the cost to society. Tim Scott's not with us right now, but I want to say what I said about him earlier. It is not easy to talk about criminal justice reform back home. We are frankly not asked about it a lot. So for him, it is a dual challenge of both elevating an issue to the level of public consciousness and then addressing the merits in a respectful way. It takes courage to do that, and that we're lucky that Tim has that in abundance. And I want to say this on behalf of Senator Booker, who was with us earlier. He not only talks about criminal justice reform and open congressional hearings, he talks about it at corner tables of restaurants with no one else around. He talks about it in private conversations when there's no attention to be had. And he even talks about it with people with whom he may not agree on any other issue, which demonstrates a level of commitment that is necessary to effectuate change. There is nothing more disheartening than to hear our fellow citizens express distrust or disrespect for our justice system. When all the other institutions of society are challenged, the justice system should be the one that we can run to. To paraphrase from an old hymn, the ground at the foot of the courthouse is level. We should have confidence in the justice process from the moment we enter the courthouse until the debt is paid and the correction is complete. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on how we can help those re-entering society, what works, what doesn't work, and how we can bolster confidence in this realm of our justice system. And with that, I would recognize my friend from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, let me congratulate you and welcome you in your debut as our new chairman. I think, speaking for all of the Democrats, we look forward to working with you and trying to find common ground as much as we can. Parenthetically, let me make a note, however. House Rule 10, Clause 4, authorizes this committee to, quote, at any time to conduct investigations on any matter without regard to the jurisdiction of another standing committee. Under the Obama administration, God knows this committee never hesitated to exercise this broad authority. From Operation Fast and Furious to Benghazi, by the way, we even sent the retiring chairman to Libya on the Benghazi investigation by this committee, the IRS, or Secretary Clinton's emails. We conducted these investigations while there were parallel ongoing criminal investigations in some cases, and when other committees had full-blown investigations or overlapping jurisdictional authority. I do not think this committee can unilaterally give up its oversight responsibilities with respect to the Russia thing, conflicts of interest, or any other matter involving a new administration that may come to its attention. Oversight is not a matter of our personal or political preferences. It is a constitutional and institutional duty. Having said that, turning to the subject at hand, I want to acknowledge, as the Chairman just did, our ranking member. He's been a leader on this issue. This is a passion for him about criminal justice reform. He sends his regrets, but he's recovering nicely, and he'll be back with us, we hope, after the recess in July. And the Chairman was gracious enough to schedule a second hearing, which would then allow Ranking Member Cummings, obviously, to participate. From my point of view, there are 4 key principles that ought to guide our efforts to ensure that punishments fit the crime and that ex-offenders have a real chance to turn their lives around. First, as Ranking Member Cummings has written, we must acknowledge, quote, that each person's ability to be self-sufficient in a law-abiding way is a core pillar of public safety. Expanded educational and economic opportunity will make us not only more prosperous, but safer as a society, unquote. Not surprisingly, lack of education and opportunity significantly increase the risk of imprisonment, as we heard from our 2 colleagues in the U.S. Senate. An African-American man without a high school diploma has a nearly 70% chance of being imprisoned sometime in his mid-30s. In some states, more is being spent on prisons than in higher education. The President's 2018 budget initiates a unilateral retreat on public funding for education, unfortunately. It cuts the Department of Education by $9.2 billion, or 14%. It eliminates teacher instruction grants, enrichment and remediation programs that provide extended learning time, the Public Student Loan Forgiveness Program, which helps our teachers, firefighters, and public servants repay student loans, raise the Pell Grant Program, and ends federally subsidized student loans. These cuts will hurt our ability to fight crime by creating economic and educational opportunities. Second, we should not fill our prisons with nonviolent drug offenders who are no threat to the safety and well-being of our communities. When mandatory minimum sentences force judges to sentence nonviolent offenders, in some cases for decades, they not only lose their lives, their children and communities bear a devastating loss as well. And we heard that kind of testimony from our two colleagues in the Senate earlier. Alternatives to detention, like the Veterans Treatment Docket, which I help work with my local court in Fairfax County, have demonstrated success diverting individuals into community-based rehab programs as opposed to automatic, rigid jail sentences. Third, we must ensure that once individuals have served out their sentences, they truly have a second chance to get back on their feet. Too often, post-release restrictions leave men and women with few opportunities to provide for themselves and their families. I commend my own governor in the Commonwealth of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, for actively restoring the fundamental right to vote for 156,000 ex-offenders in Virginia. He personally signed the orders restoring those rights for every one of those people. I hope Virginia could be a model for other states to remove impediments that punish ex-offenders long after they have served their debts to society. Finally, we must acknowledge that our criminal justice system has disproportionately had an impact on Americans of color. African American men are more than 6 times as likely as white men to be incarcerated. Approximately 37% of the men in state and federal prisons are African American men, even though the African American population is 13% of our total population. Recognizing the devastating impact of policies like mandatory minimums on entire communities, the Obama administration worked to give prosecutors more discretion on charging decisions and to commute the sentences of nonviolent drug offenders. Unfortunately, our new Attorney General Jeff Sessions, seems to want to turn back the clock on policies we feel failed in the past and reimpose the imposition of extreme sentences for low-level and nonviolent crimes. Decrying what he labels being, quote, soft on sentencing, the Attorney General has argued for so-called time-tested criminal justice practices. The reality is that mandatory minimums and other harsh measures have been tested, and they've failed. The Trump administration's budget would also slash the Bureau of Prisons, ironically, by $1 billion, exacerbating overcrowding, eliminating nearly 2,000 prison guards and 6,000 administrative staff, which I think could jeopardize the physical safety of both guards and inmates. We do not have to choose between being just or compassionate. Smart policies, like those we heard from, advocated for a little earlier in this hearing from our two senators, and by Congressman Cummings and others on this committee, allow us to do both. We can take immediate positive steps for exactly that kind of bipartisan reform. Ranking Member Cummings and Congressman Issa of our committee have a bipartisan bicameral bill called the Fair Chance Act that's within the committee's jurisdiction, and I hope we could mark up at a near-time term at one of the markups planned by our new chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for considering the request. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and look forward to cooperating with you on this very important topic.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. We'll hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. We'll now recognize our second panel of witnesses. I will introduce you and administer the oath en banc, and then I will recognize you individually for your 5-minute opening statements. We are pleased to welcome Mr. Brian Sterling, who is the Director of South Carolina Department of Corrections, Pastor Omar Jawah, if I mispronounce anyone's name, forgive me, founder and CEO of Urban Specialists, Mr. William McGahan, Chairman of Georgia Works, and the Honorable Alexander Williams, Jr., former United States District Court Judge for the District of Maryland and currently at the Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics at the University of Maryland. I would ask all of you to please rise and let me administer an oath pursuant to committee rules. You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. May the record reflect all the witnesses answered in the affirmative. There is a clock or a color scheme that will alert you. Just keep in mind, all members have the full body of your opening statement, so to the extent you can summarize it in 5 minutes, that will allow members more time for the question and answer session. With that,
Mr.
direct.
Chairman?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Sorry, just a unanimous request. I should have asked earlier. If I could, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement by Elijah Cummings on this matter, and letters from Justice Roundtable, Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and the Sentencing Project for the record.
Without objection. With that, Director Sterling.
Chairman Gowdy, I'm used to calling you solicitor, but Chairman Gowdy, congratulations on your new position. Ranking Member Cummings, we wish you a speedy recovery. Other distinguished members, Mr. Lynch, my grandmother was actually born and raised for a time in Southie on Den Street, so a lot of my family members are still your constituents to this day. Thank you all for this opportunity and your interest in criminal justice reform. As someone who has spent close to a decade in this arena, first as a Deputy Attorney General for the state of South Carolina, and now as going on 3.5 years as the Director of South Carolina Department of Corrections, is encouraging that Congress is focused on improving outcomes in our criminal justice system. I'd like to recognize 2 people that are with me today. First of all, behind me is Sandy Barrett. She is in charge of programs and services, a lot of the recidivism things. And then I've got Warden Nina Staley of Manning Correctional. I'm going to talk about her program in a little bit. Warden Staley is also, to brag a little bit, Representative Duncan earlier talked about Clemson's national championship, so I want to talk about South Carolina's a little bit. She is sister-in-laws with Dawn Staley, who is the national championship women's basketball coach at USC. So, I'd like to also recognize Mike McCall. He's been a warden at several of our prisons around the state, at Perry and at Lee and other places. He's done some great work with recidivism. But really, I want to recognize all the correctional officers and staff from around the country, from in South Carolina and around this nation, who work really hard every day in very difficult environments, very underappreciated, very stressful, in my state, very understaffed, to keep us safe at night and also to rehabilitate. I'd like to give a quick overview of the South Carolina prison system. As of Monday, we had 20,256 folks incarcerated. 3,404 of those folks were mentally ill. That's 17% of our population. I'm going to get back to the mentally ill in a little bit. That number is the lowest since 1997. I know there are some folks from Pew here, and Senator Malloy in South Carolina and others on the Sentencing Reform Committee are responsible for that work. Representative Sanford actually signed that into law in 2010. 2016, we admitted 8,798 offenders. We're down 30% from 2010. Our recidivism rate is almost at an all-time low of 23.1%. We've closed 6 prisons, and Pew has estimated that we've had a cost avoidance of $491 billion. We moved from 11th in incarceration per 100,000 to 20th. Our crime rate is down. A lot of the work that's gone into this has been done by Pew, Senator Malloy, Governor Sanford, and innovative programs that we have. Now, I will say this, Justice Brandeis did write at one time that states are the laboratories for democracy. So some of the things I'm going to say here may translate to the federal system, and they may not. That will be up to the committee to look at in the future. One thing I always say, I look at it, is 85 and you. 85% of the folks who are incarcerated serve under 5 years. So you have a choice. We have a choice as a state. I want you to think of a loved one, a family member. Who do you want sitting next to them at the coffee shop? Who do you want sitting next to them in church? Who do you want sitting next to them at school? Someone that's been warehoused for 3 to 5 years, been fed 3 times a day, been given constitutionally adequate medical care? Or do you want someone that's been connected to their family, gotten mental health treatment, have the skills, have a job, and know how to deal with anger issues and know how to perform as a citizen? That's a choice we have as a state. That's a choice we made in South Carolina, and I think you're seeing the results of it now. A couple of programs. We do CIU, Columbia International University, Associate of Arts degree. We have Northeastern Tech. We have a lot of jobs coming to South Carolina. 4.1% unemployment rate, which makes it difficult to hire correctional officers, but it makes it really easy to get folks hired. SC Thrive, we try to hook people up with services when they leave. One of the things Governor Haley and Director Cheryl Stanton of DO said to me was, these folks are coming out, we need to get them jobs. Jobs agency corrections, 900 people a month are leaving. So now our program at DO, and I texted this to Chairman Gowdy earlier, people that go through that program, 75%, and this is after 18 months, are still employed. It teaches employability skills, how to write a resume, how to explain incarceration, federal bonding, federal tax credits. Also, we have the Second Chance program where everybody that leaves Department of Corrections under DO is signed up. They know where their services are. They know where their office is. They also have an opportunity where a couple days a week there's someone that knows how to interact with someone that's been incarcerated, because sometimes they're intimidated by the government process on helping them find a job. We do work keys, GED, apprenticeship, on-the-job training. The YOA program, and I'll be quick on this one because I see I'm out of time, 17 to 25-year-olds, 50% were coming back to prison, 50%. It was a failure. And they were coming back for a lot longer. Judge William Byers, who was a judge, family court judge, took over corrections, and Jenny Barr are doing great work with this. This recidivism rate right now, they're held to a standard, is 22%. They have a mentor. It's not someone that's there to take them to prison. That's what law enforcement is for. What they do is they're mentors, and they try to hook them up with services, but they do have graduated responses. One quick story, and I will leave on this. Note, we had one young man who kept on getting in trouble, One of the requirements of the YOA program is to have a job. So we took him down to fill out an application, and we thought he had a literacy problem. We thought he couldn't read. Well, he couldn't read because he couldn't see the paper. So we took him to a free clinic, we got him glasses, and we will never see him again. And he kept on getting in trouble because he couldn't read. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I want to thank Governor Haley and Governor McMaster for the support they've given us. Governor Haley had visited 3 or 4 prisons when she was there and really was about workforce development, and she knew that these folks were getting out and that they needed the services when they left. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, committee members.
Thank you, Director. Pastor Giroir.
First, let me say thank you to Chairman Gowdy and to these representatives for having this great committee and for allowing us to testify to give voice to the work that we do. I do want to say and start that my son, Omar Jawa II, is here, one of our great workers, urban specialist, Minister Edward Laredo. I'm saying this to my son so when he brags on me, he can be accurate that I did acknowledge him when I was in Congress. So 20 years ago, I stood before a similar committee that was headed by then Chairman Henry Hyde and John Conyers about the effective ways in deterring a child from becoming involved in criminal activity. And what we said then was that it's necessary to pursue the core of the problem. There were a number of variables that we said were the root of youth crime. Back then, it was economic disparity, cultural insensitivity, and the lack of moral identity. But concerning intervention and reformation, I warned against using a blanket solution that isolates each category of dysfunction. An effective solution to crime requires a holistic approach and one that treats the entire individual, and in turn, the larger family, and then the community. And today, we're attempting to cure the poisonous fruit that grew from that untreated root. 20 years later, these high-risk youth have become ex-offenders trying to raise families and reintegrate into a damaged society. The solution to the lack of production as citizens cannot be merely punitive, as we have been talking about, and I'm so glad that you understand it. Again, it must be holistic. We must walk people getting out of prison through the process of redemption and lead them into productive citizenship. We attempt to train, and we use what we call urban specialists to intentionally dive deep into the lives of these to transform the fundamental values that are guiding destructive behavior and degrading urban culture and greatly limiting their potential. We train and empower organizations and businesses and individuals to collaboratively operate in the community, stimulating the economy and uplifting their personal spirits. Collectively, we can help each other economically, socially, and spiritually. And in turn, we create change together to build a greater and stronger community. We use what we call a 3I model, and I would explain it if there are any questions about our model. And that model we use to empower organizations, businesses, politicians, and citizens so we can transform the urban culture. In urban specialists, we use this common approach to invade the culture. We are intrusive in our action, and we build up strong community institutions. And I'm personally committed to advancing the cause of the voiceless who suffer silently and attempt to become productive citizens of this great country. If there are ways that we can collectively ensure a better process and a better outcome, the Urban Specialist Group is ready to serve. I want to say personally that I was the first gang specialist hired by the state of Texas. So for many years, I was working inside the prisons, and my job was to negotiate peace in prisons with men who were violent. And what I realized is that most of these men were not violent perpetually. They were violent as a response to what they felt was a violation. And my job was to create civility in their mind so that their behavior could follow where their heart was going. But unfortunately, many of these men who I knew had transformed inside the prison, once they walked out, they had to go into a community that was not prepared for their transformation. So in order for them to be released from prison, they had to tell the guards that they had changed. But in order for them to go back to the neighborhoods, they had to tell the neighborhood citizens that they were the same. So it was a dichotomy of a lifestyle. So what we decided to do was go into those neighborhoods and say, who is it that can lead these young people back to their civility? And normally it was those who you did not know. It was some people who were former OGs and former gang leaders and former prisoners and grandmothers and other teachers and pastors who were an informal coalition to help transform urban culture. So what we want to do is provide as much pressure as we can and as much opportunity as we can so that those who really want to be citizens don't feel like they are perpetually left out because of a mistake or because of environmental choice. Some people do what they do because they know no other choice, but we want to give them those choices through the efforts that we do. So thank you for allowing us to be a part of this solution, and if we can offer any help, we are absolutely poised to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor. Mr. McGahan.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy and Ranking Member Connolly. My name is Bill McGann. I'm the founder and chairman of a nonprofit called Georgia Works. I'm a graduate of the University of Virginia, and I'm married to a woman for 26 years who's a graduate of Socastee High School, South Carolina. Georgia Works helps formerly incarcerated and homeless men become productive citizens. And since our founding in 2013, we have helped 316 men get jobs, remain clean, and get an apartment, and virtually all have not returned to prison. We have an additional 170 men in the program today, and they're all working toward full-time employment. About 70% of our participants are felons. When a man comes into our program, our voluntary program, we ask him to do 3 things: to be clean of alcohol and drugs, and we test when they come in and throughout the program, to not to take handouts from the government or anyone else, and to work. And over 6 to 12 months, we work with each of our clients on their obstacles to employment: the lack of a driver's license, wage garnishments, criminal history, a lack of a high school diploma, past due fines, a lack of a bank account, just to name a few. But more importantly, we work with each client on the underlying cause of their problems, which is typically an addiction or a psychological problem. Each person is assigned to a case manager who they meet with daily, and we have in-house meetings on NA, GED classes, one-on-one counseling, anger management classes, healthcare and financial planning courses, among others. The key thing that makes us different from other organizations is that we run a staffing business within Georgia Works. We contract directly with 30 to 40 businesses around Atlanta for their labor, and over 100 of our men every day go to work for these employers while they're living at our facility. The staffing business is a way for employers to try out our employee in a low-risk way. Now, most of the people in our program end up getting full-time offers from the private employers that are customers of our staffing businesses. So while a man is in our program in Georgia Works, he's learning how to be a valuable employee at a private business. He's eliminating the obstacles that might prevent him from being employed, and he's working on his addiction or other problem that's the root cause of the issues. He's also making money through his own work. It's not a handout. And we have a mandatory savings program, so when they leave, they usually have between $2,000 to $3,000, which is enough to put a security deposit down on an apartment. We're funded completely by private sources, including me. We take no government funding of any kind. I take no salary or any expenses, and our staffing business basically funds the cost of running the entire program. So there's several things that I've learned since I founded Georgia Works that I want to talk about specifically. First, there's no shortage of jobs. According to websites, today in Georgia, there's about 30,000 full-time jobs available. And there's a labor crisis in some sectors, including construction, food and beverage, commercial truck driving, auto repair, et cetera. These sectors simply can't find the labor to fill their needs. Secondly, the people in our program range from poorly educated to very smart. We've had people who stopped school in junior high, and we've had other people in the program who are PhDs. So we don't just need low-skill jobs or high-tech jobs, but we need the whole menu of jobs that fit each person. Number three, individuals don't really need to be highly trained to get a job with pretty good career prospects. Most of the men leave our program and begin full-time work around $13 to $15 without any training at all. Number four, the biggest problem, and this is what we work on the most, is bad habits, not a lack of intelligence or poor schooling. The scarce commodity is the individual, regardless of their past, who works hard, takes direction well, has good habits, and will stay on the job past the first few paychecks. Many formerly incarcerated returning citizens and formless homeless people are terrific employees. We've had many employers tell us that past drug dealers are their most entrepreneurial and creative and personable employees, and they move up pretty quickly. So that's my commercial for people to hire people who are ex-offenders. Now, Georgia Tech did our study on our program and found that our program saves $6 to $11 for every dollar invested in our program. And we can get a person from walking in the door to self-sufficiency and a taxpayer for about $2,500, and it costs the state of Georgia about $20,000 to incarcerate him. Now, where the state and federal governments can help the most at the specific level down at helping men are in a couple of ways. The first is to stop taking driver's licenses away for anything other than poor driving. We still have a whole lot of states that take people's driver's license or suspend them for drug offenses, failure to pay child support, and for other reasons. And it's really a prerequisite to get a job now to have a driver's license. Secondly, wage garnishments, particularly in the area of past due child support, are really crippling to poor men and ex-offenders. A man with a low hourly wage simply can't afford to support himself with significant wage garnishments. And then lastly, promote programs like ours that will help people ready for work, change their habits, and eliminate barriers. Now, on the state level, I'm working with the Georgia Justice Project, the Department of Community Supervision, the Georgia Department of Corrections, and other organizations to come up with some specific policy recommendations. And it's my honor to be here today, and I thank you for focusing on this on the federal level. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Your Honor.
Yes, Chairman Gowdy and Congressman Connolly, as well as my friend Congressman Cummings, wish you the best as you recover from the illness. Let me preface my remarks by thanking everyone in this committee for allowing me this opportunity to present just a few comments. I served for 20 years on the federal bench as a trial judge, and prior to that, I was the twice elected prosecutor for a fairly large jurisdiction in Maryland called Prince George's County. I now am the chair of the Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics, and my passion, of course, is criminal justice. I have three simple points that I wish to focus on. One that I think will help reduce recidivism and also address criminal justice reform. One is the need to review and for a better use of discretion. This is an area that really has not been addressed that much. All of us who are lawyers know, and prosecutors in particular, understand that discretion is the hallmark of criminal justice. Discretion is administered and exercised by police officers, judicial officers, prosecutors, even grand jurors and pettit jurors, medical examiners, correctional officials, probation and parole officers, and executives through granting pardons, clemency, and commuting sentences, just to name a few. Discretion commences and continues with decisions such as who to investigate, whether to arrest, what charges to file, who gets bond, who is to be released, whether a minor is to be charged as an adult, whether the family car should be forfeited for drugs found in a car driven by a minor, what plea bargaining is offered, and other decisions by judges and others exercising discretion. Justice often varies depending on the nature of discretion employed and exercised. For me, the issue comes down to whether or should we and how can we attain reasonable uniformity, consistency, fairness, and how we can curb or employ better standards for the exercise of discretion. Every point of the criminal justice system where discretion is used should be carefully reviewed, data collected, and policies implemented to make sure there is consistency and that a meaningful effort is being made to address racial profiling, selective enforcement, and the disproportionate impact of criminal justice on minorities. We hope that the Justice Department and Congress can take the lead in this area to establish a model for states to follow. The second point is the need to review mandatory minimum penalties. I know there's been a lot said there. The debate surrounding mandatory minimum sentences remain. While there are plausible arguments that repeated drug traffickers and those running criminal organizations and enterprises, and certainly some violent offenders and white-collar and identity fraud crimes, certainly they warrant stiff and substantial sentences in order to deter, protect the community, and limit recidivism. However, studies have revealed that Comprehensive Crime Control Act and the Career Offender Statute and enhancement statutes, unfortunately, too often single out low-level drug offenders and disproportionately affect racial minorities. The final issue that needs to be addressed, in my view, is to review and address the collateral consequences and discriminatory practices and barriers imposed upon returning citizens and those with records. The bottom line for me is, again, we need to cut back on recidivism. That is to make sure that persons with records and those with returning have a successful reentry and are not reincarcerated. And clearly there are circumstances where collateral consequences are appropriate. For example, it cannot be reasonably disputed that those convicted of child abuse or elderly offenses must be carefully screened and limited. Moreover, financial institutions must be alerted of potential employees having convictions of embezzlement. But I do believe that there are a number of situations where collateral consequences can be eased. My general view is that reducing recidivism can be best achieved by removing some of the discriminatory and unreasonable practices which prevent or limit access to health care, housing, education, and employment. And of course, there are a number of questions that can be raised again, and some of those questions would be this. Do those returning to the community require more extensive or shorter periods of supervised release? Or is it necessary in every instance for a convicted person who is applying for some type of vocational license to get a Pell Grant or for admission to an institution of higher learning, or must they be required to disclose a 20-year-old conviction that has very little relevance and relationship to the specific request? So those are my 3 points, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Georgia for his question, Mr. Heiss.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me just also take the opportunity to, I think it's appropriate to say congratulations on your role in leading this committee. We sincerely look forward to working with you as this committee moves forward. And each of our witnesses, let me say thank you, and also to the previous panel as well for the work that each of you are doing. We are very much appreciative. Mr. Sterling, you mentioned briefly in your testimony some of the things that South Carolina is doing in the diversion options for less serious drug offenses, and I'm very proud in Georgia, Mr. McGahan, what is happening there with the accountability courts, where really instead of going to jail, people have the opportunity to prevent even starting the cycle of recidivism as they get involved in a 2-year-long court-supervised program that is evidence-based, a treatment program. They're involved in community service. They get jobs, all these types of things. And Mr. Chairman, I don't know if any of my colleagues have had the opportunity to be a part of one of the graduation ceremonies of these courts, the accountability courts, but I have gone, and I tell you, it took everything I had just to fight back the tears of watching how these individuals had, over the previous 2 years, experienced life change as they saw, many of them for the very first time, community support, where they themselves had their dignity raised as they got jobs, and they broke the cycle of what many of their families had had perhaps for generations. So, Mr. Sterling, I want to come back to you, and if we can go fairly briefly, do you have any idea how many people who are currently in the percentage-wise, how many prisoners will be released at some point?
Well, most of them will be released. Sorry. I know in under 5 years, or roughly 5 years, it's 85%, and then it kind of goes down from there. But over 30 years, it's about 0.27%. 5 to 10 years is about 10%. Under 5 and under, it's 85%.
Okay, so say 10 years, probably 90% are going to be out. Is that fair to say, estimate-wise?
95%.
Okay, 95%. All right. So here's the issue that we're dealing with. These folks are going to be out.
Yes, sir.
All right, so the question then becomes, what happens with them when they're out? From what I've been able to find, well over 60% of prisoners who are released are rearrested within 2 years. In states where there are the accountability courts, that number drops from 60% down to 25%. I know in Georgia, we are well below even that rate for those that are a part of the accountability court. So, Mr. Sterling, how long, can you just briefly discuss some of the diversion options that are taking place in South Carolina?
Sure. We have drug courts, which are amazing to watch. We have veterans courts. We have Judge McCullough in Richland County has started mental health courts. As I said, 17% of those incarcerated in South Carolina are diagnosed with a mental health issue. And sometimes for these folks, getting treatment, getting hooked up with the proper medication, and medical professionals really can change their lives, and we'll never see them again. Incarcerating someone costs around $20,000 a year in South Carolina, which is one of the lowest in the nation. And by getting these treatments and having them become tax-paying citizens, we will never see them again.
That's amazing. Mr. McGahan, what y'all are doing with finding jobs and so forth, has it been difficult to find companies that will take these individuals?
Well, there are obstacles, certainly. There are some that are just not good fits, but then there are others who have a crisis and just need work. As you know, in Georgia, there's a lot of distribution centers, and our men go work there, property management companies. We have people who work in recycling, nighttime work. Because there's such a big need now for labor, and not to mention the construction, the food and beverage, the hospitality industries, we're able to use salesmen to help them overcome what their objections, their initial objections, to get opportunities for our guys.
Well, I just, again, want to say thank you for all. I wish we had time just to hit on a lot of questions. I'm sure many more will come. But, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this hearing, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
I thank the chair. Last month, Senator Rand Paul wrote an op-ed entitled "Sessions Sentencing Plan Would Ruin Lives," in response to the Attorney General's directive instructing prosecutors to pursue, quote, "the most substantial guideline sentencing, including mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug crimes." Pastor Jawar, does that policy make sense from your experience, to go back to what had characterized maybe sentencing prior to the 2013, 2012 period?
Mr. Chairman, no, I think that is a bad policy personally, because I've seen so many young people who I know who were victims of their own environment, and then they did some victimization. But to go back would say to us that rehabilitation is not possible, that this is a warehousing institute. And as Mr. Sterling said, what would you want? Would you rather have young people, older people, whomever, to come out of a prison somewhat rehabilitated, or would you rather have them just locked down until they have done enough time where it becomes punitive?
Mr. Sterling, listening to your testimony and the data, which was pretty impressive, what you're describing in terms of the recidivism rate going down in South Carolina, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I assume from your testimony you would kind of agree with Pastor Jawara on what he just said.
I do think, sorry, thank you, I keep on forgetting. I do think we are seeing success in the programs with, as I said, some of the things that we've done on the state level may or may not translate to the federal level. We have seen success in the diversion programs, but we've also seen a lot of success in the other programs that we have at the Department of Corrections. One of the things I did not mention, and I mentioned earlier, is the youthful offender program, where they are assigned a mentor. The numbers are one mentor, one social worker or youthful offender officer to about 25 people, and they are testing them for drugs. They're making sure they're working. They're making sure they're getting their education, and they're holding them accountable. We've had people that say, I don't want to do that. I would rather just go to prison, and they do go to prison, but we do use graduated responses, which that program at 50% to 22% is amazingly successful and saving a lot of tax dollars.
You know, I remember doing a tour of our county jail in my county when I was chairman of the county, and I asked our sheriff, how many people here are sort of just hardcore, no hope, versus something bad happened to them, or they made a bad judgment, or they hung around with the wrong crowd, and he said overwhelmingly the latter. There's a hardcore, but most people can be rehabilitated with the right measures. And the other irony, I think, is jails often serve as a massive substitute for mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment because we don't have the services in the community. And it puts a huge burden on people like yourself and your colleagues to provide services that one wishes were provided through a different kind of safety net. Judge Williams, from 2013 to 2016, the number of federal prisoners dropped by more than 10%, and mandatory minimum sentences were used at the federal level 30% less than they had heretofore. What's your view about mandatory minimum sentences in terms of the discretion given to people like yourself and your former colleagues on the bench?
Certainly, and I think I speak for a significant number of federal judges who did not like the idea of having been stripped of their authority to consider a number of factors when sentencing people. What mandatory minimum sentences that done effectively, and of course I'm a former prosecutor, so I certainly enjoyed that power, but the authority and the power really vests in prosecutors under mandatory minimum sentences, and they have the right, of course, to charge within the mandatory statute or not charge if someone would cooperate or give substantial assistance or what have you. And so I was very happy when some cases and also the Sentencing Commission began to restore some of the discretion that federal judges have for certain type of offenses, and I think that resulted in less sentences being imposed on a number of defendants.
One can understand why mandatory minimum sentences came up, but is it not true that the problem is it is on its face discriminatory? That's how it works. The results are discriminatory, even if the intent is not.
Well, it's certainly the impact does have a disparate impact on minorities, but also mandatory minimum sentences have an unreasonable result sometimes. And you may have seen an article that appeared in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago involving myself and an inmate who I had given life imprisonment. I had to do it because of his young brushes with the law years ago. And I looked at all of the cases. There were 8 or 9 defendants. This guy had the less involvement. I didn't want to give him the maximum sentence, but I had to because, again, his record made him a career offender. And so sometimes you have just an unreasonable result that takes place when you have these things. Fortunately, in this case, President Obama did commute his sentence, and after serving 12, 13 years, he's now out.
Yeah. Although that's sort of a last resort, we wish the law could be more flexible. My time is up, although Mr. Chairman, I don't want to deny Mr. McGann an opportunity to come in if he was getting ready to come in.
I deal with people coming out of prison and who want to get their lives back, who want to work. And many have been involved in drug crimes, nonviolent crimes, or in some other nonviolent felony. And they're terrific people, almost without exception, or they wouldn't walk through our door. These are people who have made mistakes. They've been caught up with the wrong crowd. It's too expensive for us to put these people in a prison when there are other better alternatives to handle these folks.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona, Dr. Gozar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we talk about recidivism and issues facing the criminal justice system, I wanted to take a few moments today from today's hearing to discuss the impact of programs like the Veterans Treatment Courts on recidivism rates. Veterans Courts promote sobriety and recovery through coordinated local partnerships among community correction agencies, drug treatment providers, the judiciary, and other important community support groups. Veteran treatment courts have been extremely successful in my district. The Veteran Treatment Court in Lake Havasu City, Kingman, Arizona have strong records of effective service to the veterans they serve. In Mojave County, these programs have been leaders in best practices, innovative approaches to engaging stakeholders, building support coalitions, and expanding access to effective treatments. Our veterans need focused treatment and a helping hand, and these courts provide such an avenue. The alternative is often jail. And I'm very proud that one of my own staff has been instrumental in Arizona, Sean Johnson, for getting these up and running. So, Mr. Sterling, I've got a question for you. Does South Carolina implement any type of veteran treatment courts?
We do. We have veterans treatment courts. 10% of our inmates or prisoners are self-identified as veterans. One of the things we've done recently down by Charleston and McDougal Correctional, we have a veterans dorm where I figure they've given a lot for this country, and maybe because of their service or something that happened or something they saw, they ended up being incarcerated. So we've designed a program, a wraparound program that just started, I think, back in January, where the dorm is run by veterans, and we have veteran volunteers, and we try to get these people. It's a pre-release dorm. The service isn't connected with other veterans when they leave, so they will not come back.
So it's still pretty early in that program.
It is, yes, sir.
Hard to see. Well, I've got to tell you, the application that we've seen in Arizona is incredible. You see a broken person start that process, and you see their eyes light up, getting back to peers that they want to respect and be respected for. Mr. McGahan, your program helps getting homeless and incarcerated men back on their feet. What percentage would you say are veterans?
About 10%, sir.
Do you find that they have more specific needs than others than your program?
They do. They have unique challenges and sometimes require more mental health and counseling than other people in our program.
So one of the things we found in Arizona is that a comprehensive approach is needed to getting veterans back on their feet. They need access to housing, access to jobs, and the ability to stay away from those bad habits. Do you see similar issues with those that you work with in your program?
We do, and it does take a holistic, comprehensive approach. Many veterans have been through some very difficult situations, and they haven't addressed them adequately, and that's what leads them to our program.
And it seems like these treatment courts really work because of working with your peers. They identify, they respond so much differently than you see anybody else. It's like they're letting their buddy down, you know, from the military. And there's something there. Can you explain a little bit more, too?
I completely agree. I think putting veterans with other veterans to help them. So if you have one in need and we have 2 or 3 that are more senior and who have been in the military, to help a person talk about their problems, to address them. One of the things that I have found is that many men are programmed to not talk about their feelings or the things that they've been experiencing, and to get them over that hurdle. And then once they do that and articulate their problems, then things tend to get better from there.
In your opinion, what is the primary factor that keeps individuals from going back to criminal activity?
I think bad habits. and that includes drug habits and work habits. And so if we can address, if there are an underlying psychological issue that we've just been speaking about, and then we have a drug addiction on top of that, we have to address both those issues. And then if we address those issues and we then get them in a job and get them working, they tend not to go back to their old ways.
And I think that's the benefit of these treatment courts. They give that positive influence and support on a timely basis, repetitively, in the military fashion. So thank you very much for all that you do. We certainly appreciate it. Great hearing. Thank you.
Dr. Gosar yields back. The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of the witnesses. I've learned from them all. I want also to offer my congratulations to Chairman Gowdy, and I want to thank him for his first hearing, which focuses on an issue where there have been earnest efforts on both sides. I think, Mr. Chairman, beginning with criminal justice reform as a hearing indicates that the tone you are setting for this committee, recognizing that as the ranking member, as Mr. Connolly's remarks indicate, there will be circumstances where we must disagree, but it seems to me that this was an important precedent about how to start a new chairmanship on a committee such as this, and I thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd also ask that the letter written by the ranking member, Mr. Cummings and Mr. Issa, requesting that you place H.R. 1905, the Fair Chance Act, on the agenda for the committee's next markup. That, of course, is the bill that says that only at an appropriate point may, in the hiring process, may an applicant be asked about his criminal history record. Of perhaps the most important issue for someone coming out of prison is the challenges he faced in finding employment and discouragement he faces in that regard. And of course, he will find many barriers. Some of those are to be expected. But I was interested to note that 18 states and more than 150 cities, including my own, have adopted the so-called ban the box I just spoke of a minute ago, so that employers can consider the record of any applicant, but it simply delays asking about that record. Many of us have heard really poignant stories about someone who's been out of jail for 10 or 20 or even more years, but must put, if he is truthful, must put that he has once been incarcerated. 10, 20, 30 years of exemplary behavior may not matter if the first thing the employer reads is of a record. Now, I recognize some of you are from states that have not adopted ban the box, but I am very impressed at the number of so-called red states that have. I asked my staff to find them for me. Kentucky, Louisiana, Missouri, Oklahoma, Tennessee. Now, of course, Judge Williams, Maryland has adopted ban the box. Now, I'm not asking the others of you to take a position on what your state should do, but I'm asking you whether or not you think ban the box legislation has been useful, or otherwise to explain to me why apparently, regardless of where the state has stood on other matters, it seems to be in line with other states that are far more liberal than it is on ban the box. I'd be very interested in Mr. Sterling, Pastor Joa, and Mr. McGowan on that question. Would it be useful to consider ban the box in your state?
Governor Haley and Cheryl Stanton from Dew, we actually had a summit with a bunch of businesses, and we asked them to look at and hire people that were incarcerated. I do understand why some companies, and it is a frustration of mine when I go to companies and say, well, you hire these folks, and they say, we don't, and I say, just give them a chance because they're going to work hard. But I do understand why some companies can't for various reasons if they work with financial services. So a blanket policy of banning the box, I think you would get people down a path, and then they would find out that there was a record or there was a reason not to hire that person. So I think this is something that we encourage in South Carolina companies just to look at hiring second chance employers, and that's my role as a Department of Corrections director, is to go out and find those. And these ladies sitting behind me, that's their role and their staff's role to find that.
I'm glad you mentioned that there are some instances where you would not want to have such a person hired. But after you find out, Mrs. Sterling, about the record, you can still refuse to hire. So there's no such thing as once you find it out and you don't hire, even though it's been 30 or 40 years ago, I'm still requiring you to hire. And the notion that you raise is very important about what your conviction was in. And Mr. Chairman, if I may just hear the answers of the other two gentlemen, because I recognize I'm over time. Pastor Jawa?
Yes, we, in Texas, we've been dealing with that. And what we have found is that that legislation would help us, even if we had to modify it somewhat, because I do recognize what Ms. Sterling was saying. But what we see more than that is that there are not enough tools to protect those who have reformed, that there's a reformation process, but the punitive process goes beyond them reforming. So a friend of mine would say that a good heart needs a full stomach and a busy hands, or else they'll return to the other behavior. So what I've always pushed from our local and state government is to figure out ways to eliminate the barriers, and that would be another tool. Just as many tools as we could have in our toolbox, for me, is important, because that's where we are. We are at a state of emergency where those who are truly trying to do right are prevented by things that they have done wrong in the past.
In Georgia, Georgia has banned the box for state jobs, which is an executive order, and for occupational licenses. But Georgia Works is based upon banning the entire application. We don't even, we tell employers, just let us show up with 5 or 6 guys, regardless of their past, see if you like them, let them get to work there, and they inevitably like them after a few months. So we put all the paperwork aside, say, try out our men, and this is a pitch for our employment agency, and then you'll like these guys, and then our guys will get hired full-time jobs. And then the application comes after they've even started working there on a temporary basis. So I'm for banning the box, I'm for banning the application, and eliminating the barriers to employment.
Very innovative. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not an attorney or a lawyer or a judge, but I was in county government as it was county judge executive, sort of the county executive. My impressions of criminal justice reform were informed by my experience there as county executive, where the jail was the biggest expense in the county, and it does not create any revenue. And you see situations there that just don't make any sense. Like a Gulf War veteran who's serving 1 year. We house state inmates as well in the county jail. The state pays to keep them there. A Gulf War veteran, decorated, serving a year for non-child support. Okay, now that's despicable not to support your children, right? But how does that improve the situation? Now this man is a felon with a 1-year sentence. He's virtually unemployable. Mr. McGahn, can you speak to that?
Well, that's crazy. I mean, right? I mean, we have a guy who is not paid his child support, so he's put in jail, which he then further cannot pay his child support. So, you know, and which goes back to one of the points I wanted to make, which is, first of all, a Gulf War veteran has been through a lot, probably has an underlying issue that needs dealing with, probably has a substance abuse issue as he tries to self-medicate on top of that. So we need to get to the core problem to help that person, so then he can then get employment and then pay his past due child support. So that's the first point. The second one is just, you you know, past due child support is onerous on low-earning humans, people, returning citizens. It is preventing them from getting payroll jobs. It's incenting them to do under-the-table work. It's incenting them to do criminal activity. And because for a small portion of folks, they just can't afford to pay for themselves because of these issues, these wage garnishments. So, and it's not, and we, of course, we want people to pay, if absent fathers, we want them to pay for their children. There's no question about it. But there's a portion which get behind, and then it becomes too big of a mountain for them to climb on their own. And we just have to, and we're incenting behavior that we don't want. And the general problem is we have all these employers who have open jobs, and we have all these people who want to work at them, and we have these barriers in between. And we have to knock those barriers down.
Ms. Norton sort of covered this, but what role does expungement play in?
Well, we've had some success with some folks to go back and get past due child support eliminated. And we've thought a lot about this. For people who have younger children, you know, we have had some success in getting it reduced, or the payments reduced, not the total amounts reduced, because we want those fathers to pay. But for some people who are 60 and their kids are long gone, their grandparents, we're talking about mountains of past due child support.
Well, let me just be clear, and I want to move on to another topic. I'm not advocating non-support here. I'm just saying sometimes we do things that compound the problem and cause the children never to receive any support if we cause the father to be unemployable. I want to move on very quickly. I am the lead Republican sponsor on a bill with Congressman Bobby Scott called the Justice Safety Valve Act, which would give judges more discretion in applying the sentencing. In other words, discretion to override the mandatory minimums across the board. It occurs to me, listening to you, Judge Williams, that there's already sort of a safety valve in there that my colleagues here don't understand when they keep, it seems like every 2 or 3 months we pass another bill with a mandatory minimum in it. But they don't understand the prosecutor has discretion as well and may choose not to prosecute that particular crime because that mandatory minimum is in there. So by putting a mandatory minimum in there, is it possible that sometimes we cause certain crimes not to get prosecuted? You know, they might choose another one if they didn't think the mandatory minimum was appropriate. Can you speak to that, Judge Williams?
Yes, that's why I mentioned that all points of the system where discretion is utilized needs to be reviewed. Certainly, the safety valve is one mechanism to undercut some of the harshness associated with mandatory minimum sentences. But in addition to that, I would just like to see an equalization of the discretion and the authority, both for prosecutors as well as judges. And you're right, Congressman, prosecutors have a way to get around even the safety valve by charging or making some other decisions on prosecution that, again, would lessen that impact. So I would just like to see, again, a review of all of that legislation, all of those policies, so there can be more of an equal distribution so that judges can take into consideration a few more factors to make sure that appropriate sentences are handed down.
If just in closing here, I just want to say one other crazy thing I saw at the county jail, state jail level is public perception. People think, they feel good when they see inmates picking up trash on the side of the road. What they don't realize is they are not learning a vocation that's going to be transferable back into society. So even though that may score points with the public officials to have the inmates out there picking up trash, we might be doing society a better favor to teach them or to have them do tasks where there are employable skills that are being picked up. I'll just, Pastor, did you want to say something to that?
Yes, sir. I think you hitting on a vital point that the skill set that a person needs is not just what they can do with busy work, but what they can do to further their societal advantage. What I tell some of these young men is that your characteristic have a market advantage in the neighborhood that you're living in, but we need to help you transform your character. But they have skill sets that's beyond being at the bottom rung. One of the things I say to investors is don't ask these young men and young ladies how to be workers. Ask them, do they want the world to be an employer? What is their best way, not their minimum qualification, because they don't have a lack of understanding, a lack of brilliance. A lot of times it's a lack of environmental support to get them where they're going. So I totally agree with you.
Thank you. I see my time's expired.
Gentleman from Kentucky yields back. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get into the question, let me compliment you for holding this hearing, for inviting this great witness panel, as well as the two previous witness panels. All of them have given voice to the circumstances, and they've also stressed access to opportunities. So I appreciate this hearing, and also to the ranking member. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, more than half of all state prison inmates are reincarcerated within 3 years of release. About 2/3 of the estimated 600,000 new incarcerations annually are people who have failed on probation or parole. A 2012 report from the Council of State Governments Justice Center also found 53% of state prisoners and 46% of federal prisoners in the year prior to their arrest met the DSM-IV criteria for substance dependence or abuse. Judge Williams, in your experience, can untreated substance abuse disorders contribute to individuals failing to meet the requirements of their probation or parole?
Yes, in the federal system, we call it supervised release. But let me say this, Congressman, I absolutely agree with you. The failure to provide adequate mental treatment and counseling while incarcerated, and even when they're released, contributes in a mighty way to recidivism. And I headed a task force in Maryland studying that issue, and there was a lot of testimony from stakeholders and people who had been out saying that there's a lot of stress and buildup of mental anxiety associated with people incarcerated, and they didn't think, and these were people who were affected, they didn't think that enough was being done in the prison to address that issue so that they could handle their release once they came out. So I agree with you.
Thank you. And let me ask Mr. Sterling, do prisons and jails face challenges in effectively treating inmates suffering from substance abuse disorders?
Yes, sir. When I took over October 1st, 2013. In January of that year, Circuit Court Judge Baxley in South Carolina issued a 46-page order of how the mentally ill were being treated at the Department of Corrections. It was a decade-old lawsuit by P&A, and one of the first things I did is I wrote a letter to P&A and I said, please sit down with me as a practicing attorney. I knew the benefit of mediation. So we sat down, we had a retired judge mediate it, and we settled that matter in January. But treating folks with mental health issues while incarcerated is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult to find our vacancy rate for mental health professionals. We have one psychiatrist, and when St. Peter meets her, she's going straight into heaven because she's been on call for almost a decade. We are doing what we can with what we have, but hiring people, South Carolina does not have a lot of mental health professionals, and I'm on another committee working on that. But treating people that are incarcerated with mental health issues and getting the proper staffing is very difficult. On top of that, a lot of corrections facilities across the country, mainly in the southeastern states, have high high rates of vacancies for their officers. So if you have officer vacancy rates, you have lockdowns, which exacerbates the problem. They can't get treatment, they can't get into group. We're in the early stages of trying to fix that, but it makes it very, very difficult to treat these folks. One last thing, and I know your time's quick. One thing we are doing is we've partnered with our drug agency. A lot of people that are addicted to opioids are starting to come into our prisons. So we are starting a program in August, where we're going to give them a pill, and then we're going to give them shots on the way out that will be an opioid blocker. And we're doing this with about 10, and we're going to follow them for a time to see how they do, and if it's successful, we will expand that program.
So the opioid epidemic is affecting recidivism rates.
Well, it's so new to South Carolina. I would say drug addiction does affect, but opioids are starting to come into the state. It's not as much as some of the other states, but we're starting to see it, and I'm trying to get ahead of it. It's not like some of the, I'd say, West Virginia and other states like that.
Mr. McGann, are you seeing this?
Not in inner city Atlanta, no. We're still dealing with alcohol, marijuana, and crack.
I see. Mr. Chairman, my time is up. I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate being here on your very first day as chairman. Appreciate also your work in partnering with us and Senator Tim Scott and working with chancellors throughout the Historical Black College and University, and even talking about some of these issues with those wonderful people. Let me first commend Pastor Jawar for honoring your son as a former pastor and pastor's son. I respect that. I'm sure it's reciprocal in many cases, or at least eventually get there if you're like most pastors' kids. But I do appreciate that. I appreciate your calling. I appreciate what you're trying to do here. I think it's incredibly important. There's a lot of talk in this area these days. And I've often thought how much of that actually comes or is able to formulate into some kind of substance where we're seeing results. We're always talking about awareness, and good in some ways, but how do we translate that to action steps? And I've often thought that in many cases this has to start with relationships. And I'm not talking about pandering stuff or knowing the talking points. I'm talking about getting involved in these communities and showing up, sitting on the back row sometimes, even when you're not the featured speaker, to be able to engage. We've done some work over the years in the inner cities of places like Cleveland and New York and Baltimore, and I will never forget, certainly not soon, anytime, is what the gentleman that we were working with and his family there in Cleveland, when we said, what is it that we can bring? And he said, Mark, if you'll bring hope. He said, bring hope. And I see many times, sometimes, that we've lost the hope in these young men and women. Sometimes they've never seen hope before. And I wonder, with all the great policies and programs, we can't just force a template in different communities and societies without adding hope and the relationship component to that. And I challenge myself, and I'm grateful for the different people that are here today, because I've heard a little bit of element in all of that. My question today, for you, Pastor, and maybe some others, is when it comes to education, how crucial of a role does education play in this process when it comes to the reentry component?
Well, thank you, and I believe that education role is important in this sense. I believe it goes back to what you said initially, though. It's relational education. It's not just what they learn, it's what they retain, and they retain it from mentors and coaches. I had a man who had 1,000 years. He had a 1,000-year sentence for a crime he didn't commit. Harold Hill, he got released. And he said to me, he said, man, the strong rule the weak, but the wise rule them all. He said, because he was a very thin man, he said, so when I came into prison, I had to figure out what it is I could learn, not who it is I could intimidate. And when he came out of prison, his whole platform was, how do I become educated enough to show these other young men that they don't have to do what I did and they don't have to go through what I went through. So I believe education in its purest form, high school diploma is absolutely necessary. But there's a relevant education that comes to relationship that teaches one and reaches one. And as a pastor, I've said it's discipleship. It's how do you disciple that person through an environment that is known to destroy you.
It's got to be a genuine investment instead of just something out of a book, in my opinion here. I want to may have the other guys weigh in, but I want to get to something else, something that's not in the notes that I want to talk about just for a second. We're always talking about educating these men and women who are reentering society. What I don't hear talking about sometimes is educating those who are working with these individuals. Let me give you an example. Recently, I had a pastor's breakfast there in North Carolina, represent 50, 60 pastors there, and I just boldly asked him, I said, how many times in the last 6 months have you used the terminology second chance, or get rid of the box, or just criminal justice in general? Had 2 raise their hands. So when we talk about education, it is important that we find that skill set to reenter society, but how important is it for those who are community and society leaders when we're talking about these policy when it comes to the education of those providing? I want to start with Mr. McGahan, and also then Pastor, if you want to weigh back in as well.
Sir, I think it's very important. I think just having this hearing is incredible because it makes people realize, first of all, we have a big problem of many people that are coming, reentering society from prison, and that secondly, that we should welcome those folks with open arms back to our communities once they've paid their price. And people make mistakes, and they can change, and they can move on from there. And I think that's an important thing for all of us to talk about.
And you know, you made a statement about those who serve. The most profound thing that I found is those who are serving normally are the most tired, the most frustrated, and you know, agitated with the population. And it's normally because they are behind the curve. So they are learning, and their learning is from bad experience. So absolutely, we need to do as much training, opening people's minds up to a different way, because, you know, there's one idea, and if that one idea is not producing, normally we just double down on that idea, regardless if it's producing results or not.
Thank you, Pastor. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. I would tell my colleagues they're expecting votes around 4 o'clock, so if we assiduously adhere to the 5 minutes, we can get everybody in before we go vote. With that, my friend from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my congratulations to your new appointment. It'll be good to be working with you. I do have a matter of some interest on just procedural aspects of the work of this committee before I ask our panelists some questions. It has been a matter of longstanding constitutional precedent that Congress, and specifically this committee, is empowered to investigate matters within its jurisdiction, and to see that the laws are faithfully executed. And I think it's beyond argument that foreign interference with the democratic elections is an appropriate, if not compelling, area of inquiry for this committee. Also, given the history of congressional inquiry from the struggle for civil rights to the Vietnam War and to the Nixon impeachment, this current refusal of this committee to take up the reports of our intelligence agencies, including the NSA, CIA, and FBI, who all report with high confidence that our elections were hacked, I think our refusal to investigate is not only disappointing, but perhaps shameful. I, however, remain hopeful that with your leadership, Mr. Chairman, and with Ranking Member Cummings' leadership as well, that we can look back and at some point take up this issue of foreign interference with democratic elections within this committee. If there's any issue out there that is beyond Democrat, beyond Republican, beyond independent, it is whether or not we enjoy full integrity in our electoral process here in the United States. I think that's important to all Americans, and I hope at some point we can do it in a non-political way. Forget about the last election. Mr. Trump won, but we're going to have another election, and we want to make sure that we are able to protect the integrity and the results of that upcoming election. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, we all have an intense interest in the legitimacy of that outcome. Turning now to our panelists, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your wisdom in selecting this group. They've been absolutely fantastic today. I've had a chance to meet with a lot of my prison officials. I visited, and Mr. Sterling, my warm regards to your family in my district. In my district and across the state of Massachusetts, I would say on average, 80 to 90% of my inmates are dually addicted. So alcohol and drug addiction. And that's really, and that's high. That's high. I realize that's high. I know what the national numbers are, but it's high. And we're struggling. We're struggling in Massachusetts with how to deal with OxyContin and all these opioids. I hear some great things in Georgia and in South Carolina, and I'm just wondering, so Suboxone, buprenorphine, Vivitrol, what are you using to try to help your folks so that when they come out, they've at least got, and this is a big thing, not at least, they've got that drug addiction under control, because that really, I think, dictates their resistance to recidivism. That really gets them squared away so that the drug courts, which I was a big supporter of drug courts when I was in the state legislature, and I still am. We got veterans courts as well, so things that you're doing as well. But we really got to get the drug issue, we got to get them clean and in a good place so we can work on the other problems. And I just want to hear about your own experience in South Carolina and in Georgia, if I could.
Thank you. For some folks that have drug addictions, that's why drug courts are so good. And Solicitor Chairman Gowdy knows this, but the prisons have drugs in them. You can get what you want in prison because of contraband. Everybody probably at this table knows this. Everybody that's ever been into prison knows that. So not sending some of these folks to prison is a better way in sending them to treatment. In South Carolina, because of costs, we give them 5 days of prescriptions and a 30-day, or 5 days of medicine and a 30-day prescription. But what we're doing in South Carolina is we're hooking them up with services as they go out the door. The best thing we can do, to answer your question, is have a job with benefits. Mental health benefits, health care, things of that nature. Short of that, though, what we do is with SC Thrive is if they're veterans, we hook them up with the Veterans Administration. If they have other things that we can hook them up with, we do. This new program, and I'm not a pharmacist or a doctor, but Proxen, I think is the name of it, the shot that we're doing, the pill that you take every day, you can forget. So we're going to give them a pill, see their reaction, and then we're going to give them the shot out the door, and then our drug agency is going to work with them and follow them and give them a shot every 6 months. And from what I'm told, and we did have some resistance internally, and we made a decision that we were going to do it because a lot of people didn't like long-acting injectables. So we're going to follow these people, and if it works, we're going to keep on doing it. Again, hooking them up with free clinics, things of that nature, trying to find the medication that they need. But the biggest thing is a job with benefits and a future, and as the congressman from North Carolina said, hope and a connection with family. And positive reinforcement while they're out. Maybe it's not good to go back into your neighborhood of maybe Charlestown or maybe Southie or whatever. Maybe you should move to a different area because where you are, the influences aren't good and you're going to slide back into that. Maybe move across the country, things of that nature. So we try to set them up for success and not set them up for failure. And if I might just real quick, one of the things I did when I first took over is I went to see how we release people. And we released people from our prison near University of South Carolina. We dropped them off in a van, and I saw what happened there. Some of the folks were dropped off in their prison tans without the prison stripe. So now we have clothes closets. No one leaves with prison tans anymore. We had to hire a law enforcement officer because the drug dealers and some of the women of the night were there to get these people and put their hooks back into them. So we had to hire the sheriff's department to be there to run those folks off. They didn't have a chance when they got off that bus. We also, lastly, if you are picked up by a family member, you get to leave on the first day possible. If you're not, you're going to take the bus and you're going to put yourself back in that environment. We have you wait a couple of days. Well, everybody's getting picked up by a family member. Some things we were doing weren't making sense, and we're trying to look at it, use evidence-based practices to get them to the right treatment. Again, a job with benefits is the best thing that they can have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for your courtesy. Appreciate it.
Gentleman from Massachusetts yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee, Judge Duncan, is recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for picking this topic to hold your first hearing, because I think it's very important. And I'm sorry I had a big group of constituents and also had an opportunity to speak on the floor on a bill that I was interested in. But I was a judge for 7.5 years before I came to Congress, trying the felony criminal cases in Tennessee. And I've never forgotten the first day I was judge, Gary Tulloch, who was the main probation counselor, or over the probation counselors for 16 counties in East Tennessee, he told me, he said 98% of the defendants in felony cases came from broken homes. Well, it wasn't exactly accurate. What was more accurate was that, and I don't believe it was 98%, but I went through over 10,000 cases in the 7.5 years I was there, because as most of you know, 99% of the people plead guilty and apply for probation. So every single day for 7.5 years, I read over and over and over and over again, defendant's father left home when defendant was 2 and never returned. Defendant's father left home to get a pack of cigarettes and never came back. Well, it makes an impression on you. And I can tell you, I remember also several years ago when I was still in Congress, one Friday afternoon I missed the direct flight out of National Airport, and I had to drive to Dulles Airport one Friday afternoon, and the 3 o'clock national news came on. There had been a school shooting by some 14-year-old boy or something, and they had the national head of the YMCA on the radio, and he said, children are being neglected in this country like never before. And I thought, boy, how sad it was to say something like that. But somehow or another, we have got to get out that especially young boys cannot raise themselves. And I read that 80 or 85% of the babies that are being born in some of our biggest cities are born out of wedlock. And it seems to me, I know that drugs and alcohol are involved in most of these cases, but they all seem to be secondary to that father-absent household. And I think I could go to any 4th grade class or 6th grade class in an elementary school in this country, and if I found out the family situation of these kids, I could tell you which ones were most likely to get in trouble. And every time I read about one of these boys that's doing one of these mass shootings in some place, like in Connecticut, or this one I mentioned was, I think, in Oregon and all over, you read about those kids. They come from dysfunctional families. So I think we need to do all kinds of things. I think we need to get more males teaching in the elementary schools, because so many boys are growing up without a good male role model. I'd like to see more boys get into Boy Scouts. This is a national crisis, and it's the root of our crime problem, in my opinion. And it seems to me there's just a lot of things that we need to do. I started, when I was judge, a program called, I called it Court Counselors. And I got the churches involved, and I got them to do on a volunteer basis. I said most of these young men, they have almost never sat down with a family to have supper. I said, if you just have once a month, or more often if you could do it, but at least once a month, have them to your house to have supper with the family. And it's really sad what I'm seeing. And then we need to separate these nonviolent people away from the violent people in these prisons. But I just, I'm supporting some of these efforts to, on some of these criminal justice reform bills, and I sure hope we can move on that. And I just wanted to say a few things like that, Mr. Chairman, and I'll work with you any way that I can on this, because it's a subject of great interest to me.
Thank the gentleman from Tennessee. And not only is it a great subject of interest, you're also an expert in the field, and we appreciate your perspective. The gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too join in my colleagues in congratulating you on your position of leadership and look forward to working with you. I have consistently said that in America, I still believe in the American dream, that ladder to success. That first rung is education. If you don't educate a child, how can you expect them to climb the ladder of success or opportunities in America? If you do that, you are limiting that child's success, and prison, unfortunately, is one of the limited choices they have. A 2013 RAM report stated that inmates who participate in correctional programs have a 43% lower odds of re-entering prison than those who do not. So Judge Williams, have you seen efforts to educate prisoners increase proportionally to the massive growth in the prison population? Have you seen an impact?
Let me say I certainly agree with you that education is the key, and also dysfunctional families that the Congressman talked about. Certainly all of that contributes to criminal activity and behavior. But I want to go back to something that you said. The failure to have access to appropriate education is the key.
Yeah.
There's a number of youngsters in schools who are not being taught properly. They've lost interest, and sometimes the school system is responsible for what results in them getting involved in criminal and behavior later. Now, in terms of the prison, in my state, of course, not enough across the years has been given by way of funding for enough programs to educate and prepare inmates for the new types of jobs that's out here in the world. So that's something that has to be focused, and I'll certainly agree with you that education is the key, and training.
Well, I just want to take a few minutes to compliment governor that sitting right here in this chair, I have not had very good things to say, but my governor in Michigan has taken skilled trades, which he and I partner on, and he has started a virtual welding program in prison. If you are eligible for a nonviolent probation from prison, and there are job offers being offered to the prisoners before they even leave. And can you think of the opportunity of a person who's been incarcerated that's guaranteed a job, that has a skill that you know for a lifetime will be able to work? And those type programs are game changers, and we need to step up. And Mr. Chairman, I'm telling you, we can make a difference in America with this, stopping this industry of private prisons, because the only way that they're profitable, they have to fill the cells. But if we get into the proactive mode of finding ways to stop it, we can make a difference. I have one question for Mr. Sterling. In your written testament, you indicated that under the Second Chance Initiative, Northwestern Technical College was selected as a pilot site where Pell Grants would be available to offenders. Can you explain how it works, and is it working, and what's the benefits of that, and have we expanded beyond the pilot?
Sure. So we have not expanded beyond the pilot because it's fairly new. What we did was we picked a character dorm where the offenders live amongst themselves. They're held accountable by themselves. And just recently, I received an email from Sandy sitting behind me that 10 of the folks that are in that program were either on the dean's list or the president's list.
Wow.
So that's great. And if I can briefly go back, in South Carolina, we are teaching welding. Somebody just donated forklifts because warehousing is big in South Carolina, so they're going to learn and get their certification in forklifts, brick mason, things of that nature, plumbing. We teach and do all that stuff for people that are leaving and people that are there, so we know when they leave they will be prepared. And as a plumber, they'll make twice as much as a lawyer would make by the hour.
Exactly. And this is where we need to move as a country. If we say you're going to do your time and pay for the crime that you commit, we should be committed to ensuring that this person doesn't return. If they commit the crime, yes, they should return. But how can you expect someone who knows how to be a criminal? They've proven it because they have been arrested and tried. They know how to commit crime. But if you really say the correctional system is to reform and to release a person back into society that will not be a prisoner anymore, then we have some responsibility. I yield back my time, and thank you. Thank you for having this hearing.
Yes, ma'am. The gentlelady yields back. We'll now recognize the gentlelady from New York. I would tell my friend from New York, I think they're going to call votes in a couple of minutes. I'm going to try to get my friend from Florida and my friend from the Virgin Islands in before I go so they can all go, and then I'll be late for votes and not y'all. So with that, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your appointment. And to the panelists, I've been listening in the back room and listening here too, and many of you bring a lot of experience on an incredibly important issue. Judge Williams, you recently chaired a working group convened by the Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, to examine the collateral consequences of imprisonment and criminal convictions. The working group issued its final report on December, and according to the report, and I quote, "The American Bar Association's National Inventory of the Collateral Consequences of Convictions has cataloged more than 38,000 collateral consequences of criminal convictions, which include denial from public housing and public assistance, deportation, disenfranchisement, licensing or employment restrictions in a variety of occupations," end quote. Judge Williams, can you discuss how collateral consequences affect returning citizens' ability to provide for themselves and their families? Yeah.
Certainly, and there's been a lot of studies around the country on the collateral consequences affecting persons returning back to the community. But there's a number of barriers imposed on individuals who are returning, such as, again, trying to get licenses and other vocations to get involved in. And my state, my report to focus on people who were embalmers and people who were pest controllers that needed to disclose their record in order to get a license. So that's been a problem. Of course, there's been discrimination against persons trying to get adequate housing. They haven't been able to get Pell Grants, and there's a number of employers around who are simply afraid of hiring persons for fear of litigation and other kinds of things against them. So there's a number, and we can certainly talk about voting rights. They've been also denied the civil rights associated with that. So there's a host of collateral consequences imposed on people with records, and my position has always been that we can promote less recidivism if we come up with programs that's going to assist persons to make an adequate transition back to the community.
Okay, now you've done this work on these current blanket bans, and would waiting 10, 20, or even 30 years from the time of conviction or even of release to apply for a professional permit or license be long enough to make an ex-offender eligible for employment in these categories?
What's the question?
Well, they have these blanket bans where they ban them.
Yeah, those are permanent.
They're absolutely permanent. So you can be
absolutely.
out 30 years and be a good person and have a record of good work, and you still are blanket banned.
Absolutely, and the good news is that our state, of course, is we think we're progressive, but this task force has dealt with that, and we're going to encourage the General Assembly, or the State General Assembly, to look at those blanket bans and permanent disallowance to see if they can do something about that. But that's one of our recommendations that came out of that task force.
Yeah, that's an important one. Now, could you also talk about the rights restoration certificates that you explain how these work, and are they how are they obtained, and how can they help ex-offenders stay out of prison?
Yes, one of our recommendations was to have a group and an entity assess the progress that ones returning from citizens are making, And once our organization or our entity or this department issues a certification that they're making progress, that the likelihood of them perpetrating another crime is excellent, then they get the issuance of a certificate, which would be in the hands of employers, and of course that would probably likely cause them to hire them.
Well, I think all of your testimony, your ideas are good ones. I think we should look at them. I know that this was a top concern of Ranking Member Cummings. I just talked to him on the phone, and he was so interested to hear what's happening in the committee. But also President Obama did a lot of work and studies on prison reform. And I want to thank you for what you're doing. I think it's tremendously important. And, you know, we got to help people once they get out, stay out. And you certainly can't help them if you're banning them from all types of employment. What was your recommendation on voting? I mean, you know, they take away the voting rights, too. Were you recommending that people be able to vote?
Well, we hadn't addressed that yet. That's hopefully a phase 2.
That's phase 2. Okay,
This was
my
mostly
time has expired.
vocational and occupational licensing.
Okay, well, my time's expired. Thank you.
Gentlelady from New York yields back. We have a prosecutor and a former police chief left. Y'all are used to working together. I'll let you continue to work together, and you can apportion time however you want. I'm gonna go last. You can, however you. I think they're about to call votes. So, Ms. Plaskett, I think you are technically up first, but y'all can do what you want with the time.
Thank you. I will be very mindful of the time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. In 2013, former Attorney General Holder issued a memo to federal prosecutors urging them to ensure that our most severe mandatory minimum penalties are reserved for serious high-level or violent drug traffickers. The Holder memo, as it was called, was guidance that in cases involving applicable Title 21, gave prosecutors discretion to make a, quote, individualized assessment and fairly represent the defendant's criminal conduct. Judge Williams, I'm so glad to have you here. What improvements did Attorney General Holder's charging policy make in the criminal justice system?
Yes, certainly. Once that edict came down, the federal prosecutors in my jurisdiction had a little more authority to offer pleas that did not involve mandatory minimum sentences. And so everyone essentially was pleased with that. And I don't have any statistics before me, but I know that the severity of penalties and the long sentences were decreased with that edict that came down from the attorney.
On May 10th of this year, Attorney General Sessions rescinded that policy and issued a memorandum that directed all federal prosecutors to charge and pursue, quote, the most serious offenses that carry the most substantial guidelines, sentence, including mandatory minimum sentences. Judge Williams, in your experience, why is charging the most serious offense not always the most effective way to deter crime?
Yeah. Again, I think that's misguided, and it's just not appropriate in every case to direct the prosecutors to charge the most serious offenses. Again, every case is different, and there ought to be an easing of that philosophy, and I just disagree with whatever that edict is.
Thank you. And you know, I as well have been a prosecutor at a local level in the Bronx District Attorney's Office in New York City, and then at Main Justice, working at the Justice Department. And it's my belief that this memo sends a chilling effect on our justice system, both at a prosecutor's level to make prosecutors really go after the most serious charge, but also sends a message to policing as well, in terms of criminals and how police are going to be handling the individuals that they encounter on the street, and what the message is from the highest level of law enforcement should be done. You know, I talked with our chairman quite often about the fact that being a prosecutor was, to me, one of the most wonderful jobs that I had. It was a dream of mine. I come from a long line of law enforcement officers. My grandfather, my father were police officers, uncles, and I had to leave that job because I got tired of every day looking across the courtroom and seeing what looked like myself. Seeing my sons, in essence, every day, and having to issue some of the most harsh charges on the people that I now represent, people that look like myself, people with names like John and Russ and Edmund, and names that families have given their sons because they believe in them, names that I have given my own sons. I have 4 sons. And every day, things like this from Jeff Sessions is really an indictment against my own sons. And I take that as a charge against them and them that look like them that says to scoop them up and put them away. And that's the way we're going to deal with individuals that look like that. And I'm really grateful that we're having this discussion. I'm thankful that my colleagues across the aisle were willing to listen, to come up with solutions, not just for what happens in prison, but before that. It's not just criminals that are scooped up. Many of us who have young black men as children, we give them, and I'm going to use this term, they're going to get their Negro wake-up call. Because as much education as they have, whatever they look like, as much how middle class their families look like, they can be scooped up by the police just because of what they look like. And it's happened to all of us at one point or another. So I yield back the balance of my time, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing us to have these discussions.
The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands yields back. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to you, and thank you to all of our witnesses, and thank you for the outstanding work that you're doing. I spent 30 years in law enforcement, and I'll be one of the first to say that the criminal justice system, like other systems, definitely needs to be improved. But I also know from my own personal experiences that many times we ask the criminal justice system to do too much. We ask prisons and jails and even law enforcement to deal with issues that they were never designed to deal with. Even though there are an array of issues that fall in that category, mental health is certainly one of them. The Urban Institute did a study and found that 45% of federal prisoners, 64% of jail inmates, and 56% of state prisoners have mental health problem. There was a sheriff from Marion County, Indiana, who raised the issue during a meeting with President Trump recently. And he said this, and I quote, there are people with mental illness who, for lack of a better term, warehoused in our jails across America because we don't have the facilities necessary to take care of them. That's a sad statement. We also know that studies show that ex-offenders who are homeless are 7 times more likely to reoffend. The bipartisan 21st Century Cures Act enabled during the last Congress reauthorized the Adult and Juvenile Collaboration Program and authorized $50 million annually through fiscal year 2021. The Act also expanded authorized activities under this program, including allowing grants to be used to provide a broad array of services to incarcerated individuals, including crisis response. However, this program has not been funded at authorized levels in recent years, and President Trump's budget continues that trend by requesting only $10 million for this program. Judge Williams, I'd like to start with you. If you would just, and I know we've talked about a lot of things, you may have already talked about it, but what are some of the ramifications that you see as it pertains to recidivism and other issues when programs like this or funding like this are cut that so help to uplift those who have been incarcerated, and anybody else who would like to respond as well? Thank you.
All right, well, I'll just start off by saying cutting these programs certainly is not helpful for the entire idea of reducing massive incarceration. There's just a number of different factors that you have to take into consideration, the poverty, the family dysfunction or situation, the lack of access to appropriate education, and the number, even the environment. Certainly all those things need to be addressed, and I think proper funding would certainly help. I want to say one other thing. We all are getting concerned about the increase indictments of law enforcement officers around the country right now. And that's a real problem for persons as myself who have been prosecutors, because we have to, in arguing to juries, we want to make sure that we have people with integrity on there, and that lack of credibility is becoming a problem, and so it's going to invest itself in the criminal justice system. So that's a problem also that we really haven't addressed adequately.
Any others?
One thing I'd like to talk about that we use through Department of Justice is training our officers, CIT, crisis intervention, how to de-escalate a situation. When the mental health case came out and we started training officers, I think we've got, I'm going to guess, around 200 to 300 officers who they can then take over a situation, even if they're not the highest ranking officer, and they know how to interact. It's a 40-hour class. We put a placard on them, and they're the folks that come in and help de-escalate a situation. And the first weekend, we talked to an offender out of swallowing a razor blade. And the officer went home safe, and that offender went and got mental health treatment and is alive today. That would have been a great cost to the state, and that officer could have been in peril. So the CIT training is great. I have not read the budget, so I don't know about that, but this is a program that was offered to us, and we took advantage of it.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady from Florida yields back. The chair will now recognize himself. Brian, I've told you on countless occasions you have the hardest job in all of law enforcement in South Carolina, and you do it so well. And one thing I'm so happy about today is you and your co-panelists are getting credit for trying to solve very, very difficult challenges. You also were a prosecutor in a former life, and it strikes me, you tell me if I'm wrong, it's tough to get a conviction, particularly a jury trial, beyond a reasonable doubt. 12 folks, hard to get them to agree. So what happens sometimes is you'll take a plea to probation because it's so much easier to revoke probation in front of a judge later on, and you get the same result. You go to the Department of Corrections, you just get to bypass the difficulty of a jury trial. How do you see most of the probation revocations coming into the SCDOC, and what can we do at that stage to kind of limit the inflow into your facilities?
Sure. So one of the things that came from the legislation and the sentencing reform oversight with Pugh and Senator Malloy was how people were revoked. And that is one of the reasons that, number one, we're not sending as many people to prison, but we're also not revoking for, say, technical violations. I spoke with Jerry Adger, who used to be my Inspector General of the police force, who was a former SLED agent, South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. And during his testimony last year, he said, you know, we would go tell someone they had to pay their fees, and if they, or you're going to jail, and if they couldn't pay their fees, guess what? We were furthering criminal activity because they would go find the money another way. So we work with them and find ways to work out the fees that they have to pay. And sometimes if we have to waive the fees so we don't send someone back to prison, that's what we do. But they try to do everything they can to avoid sending folks back to prison. With our youthful offender program, the one that used to be 50% recidivate, now it's 22%, we have graduated responses. We can put an ankle bracelet on. We can do more checks. We can say you can't go to this area. We can say you have to get a job. Or we can bring them back for a time, and then they leave. And we're seeing the success of that also.
Something was touched upon, I think it was Mark Walker from North Carolina, which is the perception of the broader public of criminal justice reform in general. I don't think you and I are going to be accused of being soft on crime, and we talk about it, given what we did in previous lives. But there is a perception, and sometimes, you know, because we live in a culture that's kind of dominated by episodes. You can have 90% of the people successfully part of a program, but that one episode where there's a recidivist or another crime committed tends to impact public perception. So what would you say to our fellow South Carolinians, as a former prosecutor who is not soft on crime, how not to be swayed by episodes of failure, but to go ahead and pursue both the diversion programs on the front end? I'm sure you had a tough time explaining to the victims of crime why someone was out on bond, particularly if they had a bunch of charges pending. So what would you say to the broader public about why it's still worth pursuing diversion programs, reentry programs, criminal justice reform, despite the fact that we're going to have episodic failures?
Well, as a grandson and a great-grandson of a police officer, and as a victim of a crime by someone who was out on bond and had been convicted before, who broke into my house, I too understand being a victim. But it's balancing, and in South Carolina, it's a very fiscally conservative state. Saving those tax dollars and seeing the recidivism rate go down, not spending the $20,000 a year. Also, the public safety, our crime rate is down, and I think it's because of what we're doing. I think it's also because of employment, 4.1% employment. It's a magic bullet. When someone's working and participating in society, as they're doing in Georgia and other states, I think that works. Education. 10th grade is the average education level of folks that come to the Department of Corrections, so getting an education. And maybe, it's not college, maybe it's a technical, and you could start a job, and you can start a business, and you can grow it from there. I just had my air conditioner replaced. I know how much an AC repairman makes. I mean, it's a substantial living.
Yeah, this is my last question, and then we'll go to the gentleman from Wisconsin. There's been some discussion, I know Senator Booker, Senator Johnson from the great state of Wisconsin. It's bipartisan, what some people refer to as ban the box. There is, Judge, I think you'll appreciate this, there is a body of research that it actually, at least in one study, had a disparate effect on the very group that we're seeking to help. And even if that one study is an anomaly, I am a little bit concerned that some of the ban-the-box legislation doesn't have relief for negligent hiring. That's still a civil cause of action that you can pursue against someone for negligent hiring if they fail to ask. So it's not really a question as much as, particularly, Your Honor, you're an academic now, in addition to being a jurist. If any of the four of you have ideas on how to both solve that negligent hiring aspect and also deal with that one study out there that says it really has a disparate impact on communities of color, despite the fact that that is the opposite intent from what the legislation is. Well-intentioned, but still hurting the cause is not good. So, yes, sir.
I can give you a quick question. We have a need for truck drivers in South Carolina. And I've had conversations with many truck drivers and many folks that were defense attorneys in the insurance industry. And one of the things that will come into court is if you're driving a truck and you hit someone, your record is going to be used against you. And I've had conversations with legislators saying, if it wasn't a driving charge and it didn't affect, why should that come in as evidence in court? But I understand why insurance companies and businesses would have a concern. So that is not a ban the box, but it is an example of problems. We are still going forward and going to train on that because there's companies that are willing to hire, but they will probably have to pay higher premiums because that will come into a court case, which is not really fair.
You're right, it will.
Mr. Chairman, briefly, I mean, that's a real issue that you've raised, the whole question of personal liability that the companies have. And I think the state legislatures are going to have to move to immunize those particular companies that reach out and employ returning citizens. They have to give them the leverage to do that. And also, we need to come up with some other incentives to give to employers and to make sure that they will be receptive to hiring people without records. But that's a real issue that has to be addressed.
Yes, sir. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, can
Thank
I ask
you.
a question?
Yes.
Sorry, I was in the...
Because I raised this issue initially. I wonder if this disparate effect is because while you don't know you don't know about the record, but the person has applied. So you know the race. So the reason for the disparate effect or the failure to hire may really be race and not the record, the record of the
That's exactly what that study indicated, but it has a negative impact on one of the very groups that you would be seeking to help. So again, under the heading well-intentioned, but this study may be an outlier. It may not be accurate. The judge is now an academic, and there may be 5 studies that debunk that one study. I don't want us to go down a road, if there's a way to fix that, without having unintended negative consequences. But the lady from the District of Columbia is right. It was race-related, and that's what the study found. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Before I ask a question, I'd just like to make a statement. There was a comment made earlier today kind of poo-pooing or saying it's no big deal, nonviolent drug crimes. And in my district, I have a heroin problem. And part of that heroin problem is fueled, I believe, by prosecutors and judges in a county south of mine, Milwaukee County, who apparently think that if someone's caught selling heroin, it's not that big a deal. And I think in this country every year, thousands of people are dying of opioid abuse. And there are a variety of things that can be done to prevent it. But one of the things that I think is encouraging it is people who put this idea out that, you know, selling of drugs is a victimless or harmless crime. Thousands of people are dying of this harmless crime. And I strongly disagree with my colleague who kind of implied that if you put somebody in prison for trying to sell heroin, it's no big deal. It is a big deal. A lot of people are dying because of that. Now, Mr. McGahn, hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yes, sir.
Pretty good. You brought up something before that I sometimes think is interesting. You mentioned the degree to which people almost don't work because of the size of garnishes for child support. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
There is something that passed about 20 years ago around here called the Bradley Amendment, I think about 20 years ago, that in essence said that even if child support is assessed wrongly, once it's assessed, you can't undo it. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with that amendment, no, sir.
Okay. Well, in any event, you are conscious of the fact that sometimes child support gets so, it's like being in debt for anything else. The debt is so great that
it's insurmountable.
Yeah, insurmountable. You get to the point where it puts a strong disincentive to work legally, I guess I'll put it.
There's no question about it. And then the people come in and they cannot work in payroll jobs, so they have to work in under-the-table jobs, or they have to engage in illegal activity.
Good. I wish you'd follow up on that somewhere, and maybe you can educate some people around here. Next question I have, you're always looking at the cause of crime, and I know a lot has been written about, or at least people keep track of race and imply that that might have a factor in incarceration or a factor in whatever. But I wondered, as far as family background is concerned, do we have any studies related to that any of you folks are keeping track of? Mr. Sterling, do you keep track of that in the South Carolina Department of Corrections?
We don't, but one thing that was mentioned when Mr. Duncan came in was the need for a parent. One of the reasons I think we're seeing such success with our youthful offender program is these youthful offender officers. It's a 1 to 20 ratio. They get to know these folks that are under their supervision, and they're there to help them, but they're also there to keep them accountable. And they do not want to disappoint. They become mentors, and I think they become mentors for life, because a lot of folks that end up in prison just don't have a positive role model. And these folks that are giving their time and their life, because it's not just a 9-to-5 job. They're doing it on weekends. They're doing it at night, middle of the night. It's such a good program that some of the families now come to our officers and say, my mother needs help with this. Where can she go?
Okay, I'll look at both ways for you, Mr. Sterling, and maybe suggest in the future you do keep track of these statistics, because that might be illuminating, and for whatever reason, political correctness or otherwise. I know in Wisconsin we didn't keep track of this stuff either, but you might want to, maybe even just for one prison, keep track of it so we find things out. And I'm not only talking here about, you know, the parental background of the people, but say of people who are convicted of a crime, say at age 25, at age 30, do you compare, say, for men, the percentage of men who are committing crimes who are, say, married with children and those that are single or are not connected with their children?
We do. I don't have those in front of me, but I know we do a very comprehensive review and interview when people come in to try to find everything out about them when they do come in, education and things of that nature.
Why don't you get back to us? Because I'm under the impression that a benefit of families is not only for the children, but sometimes for the parents. And I have a feeling that if you check, I have no idea, I've never seen this study, that you go through all the people in your prison system and say for an age group 30 to 35 or whatever, compare men who are married with children to men that either have no children or are unconnected with their children, and see what sort of statistics you can drum up there. Can you do that for us?
Yes, sir.
It's going to take a lot of work.
That's fine, sir.
To be cutting edge. Thanks much.
Sir.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Alabama has made a Herculean effort to come. I just heard the buzzer. I think we have time, given the fact that you are so interested in this issue and made such a great effort to get here. Gary, we'll recognize the gentleman from Alabama, and then we'll break.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I had to leave. We've got this little issue of the budget going on. It's fairly important. So, a couple of things, Mr. McGahan. And what are some of the major obstacles that the states impose on you to helping individuals who are exiting prison to find work?
When a person gets out of prison, a couple things. First of all, for some folks, they don't have their driver's licenses, and they'll get state-issued IDs. And it's when a person goes in and tries to get a job, they have to give their ID, and it says Jackson State Prison, and that's, they immediately don't get the job. Having an identification or driver's license that has nothing to do, that shows their background is one, that is an impediment to work. I think the second thing that we can do is we can raise the level of garnishments. That poor people who have passed through child supports, that is a huge barrier for them to get a job. So if we can eliminate that barrier, they'll get work. And then the last thing that was mentioned before, the biggest thing that makes families stay together is when a man has a job. If a man has a job, we find that almost immediately that family, he gets involved in his child's life. He'll get reconciled with the mother. And when he doesn't have a job and when he is living a destructive lifestyle, he's rightfully oftentimes pushed away from that child in a way. So having employment, eliminating the barriers, changing his habits, and then getting a job will fix most every problem.
When you talk about eliminating the barrier, particularly in child support and the garnishments and issues like that, that is a delicate balance that you're trying to achieve there, where the state, I think, could be helpful to make sure that an appropriate amount of support is being provided to his dependent family members, but also not disincentivizing the individual from getting a job or seeking employment where he's basically paid a cash wage that's not subject to garnishment. You see that pretty much across the board nationwide. Is that a bigger problem in certain places than others?
I think it's a national problem. When I talk to my colleagues from other states, almost everyone will say one of the biggest problems that men face, which is and to get employment, is eliminating wage garnishments. And the problem is that wage garnishment, not that they don't owe the money, and we don't want to incent them to walk away from their responsibilities, but it's a question of balance of when they kick in, and having the ability to keep the first few more dollars that they earn and to pay their own way, and not an ability to pay their own rent will go a long way to getting him into an employer, getting a career going, be valued in the workplace, and then we're putting work, we're valuing work over everything else, and that will reconcile a family. But right now, I think that the garnishments kick in too low, and that creates a barrier for him to seek employment.
Let me suggest that, and this might be of interest to all of you, that back during the Bush administration, Dr. Wade Horn, Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services, oversaw a program called the National Fatherhood Initiative, where that was the very focus, was to try to reconnect these men with their families. And it was very successful. And I think that's something that might be useful to revisit at the state level as well as the federal level, Mr. Chairman. One last point. One of the things that I ran a think tank in Alabama, and one of the things that we were seeing is that this about 60 to 68% of the inmates were high school dropouts regardless of race or gender. And as has been pointed out, 90-something percent of them are eligible for parole. And we don't want to, and Alabama has a prison crowding problem. We don't want to just release those back into prison. Have you given much thought to utilizing the internet to allow these inmates to earn a high school diploma, or if they have graduated high school, to earn an associate or technical degree, so that when they get out of prison, they have employable skills? Network them with businesses that it doesn't matter that box is checked, and with a support group that helps them be reintegrated into society. And that's
Yes,
for anybody.
there are businesses that do that. There are, and I think that's a tremendous idea. But the one other piece is the habits of the person. So we have to eliminate the barriers. We have to get them skills. And then we have to change their habits, increase reliability for the employer, get them to show up and work on time, make sure they don't have an addiction. And if we can do those three pieces, then we'll have a reliable person to continue on with their lives.
Thank you for allowing me to ask questions, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Alabama for making the effort to come back despite a very hectic day. I want to end by thanking the four of you for your collegiality toward one another and toward the members of the committee, your comedy with a T, toward one another and the committee. I also want to thank Corey and Tim, the panel before you, for coming. I hope you can tell from the member interaction that it's an issue that while we may not agree on every facet of it, people are interested in it, and we value your perspective, and frankly, we benefited from it today. So thank you. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.